We need your support for the Medicine Man Gallery channel, so make sure to click the subscribe button and tap the little bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video, which we do every morning on Wednesday and Friday. See you soon.
Think, this could be bigger. This could be bigger. And in 1883, he creates Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the big outdoor show with not just a few people on stage, but all of the animals, Indians riding, fake battles, stagecoaches, wheeling around the center of the arena. And that's what really takes off. And the next 30 years, that's where he becomes almost a household name.
All right. Guess who I pulled out of the Western Writers Association meeting, their annual convention? Steve, or do you go by Steven? What do you like?
Steve is just fine.
Steve is just fine. Friesen. And we were just happened to be sitting at the same table together, and I overheard you. Actually, I didn't even, strike up a conversation, but you were saying about being a Buffalo Bill guy and how much you knew. And I thought, this guy I want to talk to. And I came up and said, hey, how about you tell me a little bit about Buffalo Bill? And he explained it. And then guess what? Here you are in the Idea Diaries. And so welcome. How about that?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I have to tell you, those kind of encounters are always wonderful because I learn more about Buffalo Bill through them as well as you're sharing with me the connection with Maynard Dixon. I love his art. I love Buffalo Bill. So it's a great intersection.
Yeah. I found, I have this drawing. What he's referring to is we have a drawing that Maynard Dixon did of Buffalo Bill, and he knew Buffalo Bill. Mm-hmm. And Buffalo Bill was a super important character in American West. But before we go there, because it's going to take a good portion of our time, because you're really one of the leading authorities on him, I want to know where you kind of grew up.
Well, I could say, like Buffalo Bill, I grew up in Kansas. Buffalo Bill was born in Iowa, moved to Leavenworth, Kansas, not too far from Lawrence, where I was born, in Lawrence, Kansas. Then I grew up in Kansas, south central Kansas, a little town, Buhler, Kansas. There were 900 people there. I was a city boy, according to all my farmer friends. But at any rate, also grew up within the Mennonite church and went to a Mennonite college. And at one point decided I wanted to do history and went to upstate New York, actually, a special program in Cooperstown, New York. And it's not a baseball-related program. It was a museum training and folklore program. And I got a degree in American folklore.
So when you're growing up in Kansas, you got any brothers and sisters?
Yes, one of each.
And what do your folks do?
My father was the town doctor.
Oh, physician.
Physician.
General practice?
General practice. Yeah. Back in those days, that was the term. And, house calls at night, the whole works. Sometimes for us kids, kind of scary phone calls like, my husband's having a heart attack. What do I do? And I just say, Dad, please come take care of this. Anyhow.
And so when did you graduate from high school?
1971.
71. So you're right at the Vietnam War, too. That's still going on.
That's right. And so actually during the Vietnam War, I was a conscientious objector because of my Mennonite faith.
Yeah. Did you have to go? Well, I guess they pulled your number, but you had already decided this is not something I'm going to do.
Right. But the number, actually, I had a high number, and when I would have gone at any rate was just when the war was winding down and they weren't drafting us anymore. I don't. I'm glad. I really, I was conscientiously opposed to war, but that was a terrible time for a lot of people. Yeah. And we have to remember it and hopefully not repeat it.
Well, and I bring this up, and I like to bring it up with a lot of my guests, because I do think it was such a pivotal point for a lot of people our age, that their brothers or they did or their friends, and, they went and died, and and it affected how they saw the world. I don't know if it affected you in those kind of terms or not.
Well, not that, but indirectly. My wife's brother was almost killed in, I think it was Phnom Penh. So there were, it's affected me since.
Oh, very much
in that kind of thing, and talking with him a little bit. But, I had a number of friends. Actually, I had some friends who also had become conscientious objectors during the war because of the war, and joined the Mennonite church as a result of that. So I have a little different view on it. But I'll tell you what, none of my people were hurling the epithets and the slurs against the returning soldiers. We felt bad for everybody.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And so as a kid, did you like history?
Yes.
You did.
Yeah, I did. They used to. I found out later on that my teacher, in fact, when I was in third grade, called me Museum Friesen because I always wanted to go to museums, and my parents took me to museums, and she said she wasn't surprised when I went into the museum field.
And
for a
how
career.
old was she? How was this?
Well, I would have been third grade.
In third grade?
Eight.
And did she call you that at that time when you were a kid?
Yeah, apparently they did. I don't remember it, but she and some of the other people called me that. And my brother and I, even during the summer, we had a pup tent or something like that where we put our little rock and shell and butterfly collections out. And so I was a nerd from early on.
Yeah,
in
well,
that respect.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I call it a nerd because I did the same thing.
Well, all right, we're in there.
I would call it, interested in the world.
Exactly.
And what all kind of things did you collect as a kid?
Well, I collected stamps,
Yeah.
like I say, butterflies, rocks, shells when we went to the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, you could find a lot of shells. There aren't so many coming up on the
Right.
beaches as there used to be. Those were the main things that I collected at that point. And then as I grew older, I remember being fascinated with things when I would, let's say we visited a gentleman who lived in a town near us who happened to have a private collection of pottery. Indian pottery.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated by that. And these kind of things. And my family traveled a lot. I remember driving through the three mesas, the Hopi mesas, and stopping and seeing those as a 12-year-old. So my parents were very, very conscious of exposing us to the world around us.
And did you collect any Native American or cowboy material?
I didn't collect cowboy material, but I did find an old photograph of my brothers and my bedroom. And it had these wagon trains all over the wallpaper. And there were a couple of cowboy hats hanging from the corner of our beds. So everybody was into that in those days. But I didn't collect that kind of material per se.
And so you went into, what was the degree? When you started college? What was it called?
Well, degree in history, undergraduate. My graduate degree is a master's degree in American folk culture.
I see.
Now, we talk about folklore and folk culture. Folk culture is a little broader in some ways because we really were interested in the material culture, the things of our lives, the things that people who are folk people have, which led me objects, exactly, which led me into the museum profession, which then led me eventually to the Buffalo Bill Museum, and working with things like Sitting Bull's headdress, working with Lakota materials, and of course a love also of a variety of art, both formal and folk art. In fact, my master's thesis was on a Swiss mural painter in central Kansas who painted scenes of Switzerland in people's houses, which is kind of interesting juxtaposition with that Great
And you
Plains.
must have known Burger Sanzine too.
Well,
Burger
I went to
Sanzine.
the museum. I
at
wouldn't know
least,
it.
well, he was alive
He
when you
might
were
have been,
alive.
but I was not aware.
But were you aware of his painting?
Oh yeah, because Lindsberg, where his material was about a half-hour drive from my house, so we would go up there now and then and see that.
Yeah, no, I would think so.
And I've been back many times.
What
since.
did your folks think about you going into a field that's not medicine or law?
Well, Dad once said, have you ever considered going into medicine?
Yeah, right.
And I said, no, that's not my thing. And as far as law goes, and this is where it gets a little quirky, at that time, there were a lot of Mennonites who weren't sure that practicing law was all that ethical a way to go in terms of your life, amazingly enough. And I think it was the issue of, distinguishing right from wrong, and the fact that a lawyer would sometimes have to defend somebody who they know was not doing the right thing. And I think they just felt that put you in an uncomfortable position. So, a lot of historians or people who get undergraduate degrees in history go into law. So you brought up a good one there. But it just never entered my mind. I was really into the history and the folk culture.
And material culture.
And material culture, all the stuff. My mom had antiques all over the house. So I was fated in some ways to move in this direction.
And your brother, you have at least one brother, any other kids?
Yeah. My brother, he went a variety of things, psychology, philosophy, physics, but he finally ended up doing GIS, graphic imaging, computer stuff, and working with urban planning and stuff like that. So he went a different way, but now he's kind of into steampunk and stuff like that. So he and I are both retired now and doing what we really like. So
well, it sounds though, and we'll get to it, that you were doing a lot of things you really liked anyway for your career.
I've been very fortunate to be able to do that in my career.
So you go to New York, and it was
Cooperstown. Yeah, like I say,
Right.
not for baseball, because that's what most people think about there.
Yeah. No, that's what I would have thought. And you get a degree in 4 years, so like 75, 76 you graduate?
Well, it was actually a intensive 1 year master's degree
see.
program.
I
So
see.
I got that there. And then moved back to Kansas and was director of a Mennonite museum for a year.
Why back to Kansas? I mean, you've seen the world a little differently. You're a Kansas boy, and I grew up in a rural community, so I understand it. But why did you go back?
I got a job offer.
That was it. Yeah, okay.
That was pretty much it. Yeah, I was one of the first people in the graduate class to get a job offer to work at a museum. That didn't exactly work out, and I got a chance to move to Colorado for the next job that I got, and that was not my first time. When I was a kid growing up, my dad loved the mountains, so we were in and out of Colorado. I worked there in the summers when I was in college. So for me, Colorado was like. And of course, it didn't hurt that John Denver's Rocky Mountain High was popular at that time. So for me, that was really the experience I wanted. And I've been going back to Colorado ever since, even though I spent a couple years in Louisiana, 6 years in Pennsylvania. Colorado has always pulled me back. When we retired, where do we want to go now? We can go anywhere. We stayed in Colorado.
You stay where you are.
Yeah.
And so you left the Mennonite Museum in Kansas, and you came directly to Colorado?
To Colorado. No, I spent some time in a museum program in Wichita, but then went to Colorado to Littleton for a job there, working in a living history museum. Actually, learned how to do blacksmithing and weaving.
Yeah,
took care of the pigs
and you had horses. And you had to do that because if you didn't understand how it was done on the most basic level, you really couldn't explain the Living History Museum.
Well, that was part of it, but also somebody had to take care of them, and somebody's got to take care of the horses and the pigs. But beyond that, also we had a kids program, and we would teach kids how to do that. So I would work with the kids, teach them how to blacksmith, teach them. We're talking about 8th graders, 9th graders coming in and learning how to blacksmith. That was really interesting.
And where was this?
In Littleton, Colorado, where I live now.
Is it still there? Is that?
Yeah, that museum's still doing quite well there. I get
What's
there.
the name of that museum?
Just the Littleton Historical Museum.
I'll have to go check it out.
Yeah, it's kind of like one of those gems. They don't promote it a lot as a tourist destination. It's very much oriented to serving the local population, but tourists still go. It's a fun place. Yeah.
And then from there you end up at the job that you have for 22 years, right?
Right. Well, I spent 6 years at this Mennonite museum built in 1719, an old house, built by a guy named Hans Herr. And that was a great experience for me. I had a lot of wonderful museum volunteers. And then I wrote my first book there.
And what was that
place?
Book?
It's called A Modest Mennonite Home.
We'll show it for those people who watch YouTube.
There you go.
Is it still around?
That is still around. It looks very much like that.
And you had Andrew Wyeth write
That's right.
forward.
Andrew Wyeth did the forward
happen?
for the book. Well, it was his ancestral home. He actually did 2 different pictures of it, and he let me use one of the pictures in the entry, the opening of the book in connection with the forward that he provided, and it was really interesting. It was kind of a fun little thing.
Did you ever
brush
get
with celebrity?
Did you ever get to meet him or not?
Not in person. I talked with him on the phone several times.
What was he like?
Well, he was very nice, very outgoing. And he was, when I called him, it was like, oh, that's no problem. I'll do it. He had no trouble with it at all. He asked me to send him some thoughts about it. You know how it is when you sort of speaker's points kind of thing and do something like that with it. But it was just very open and very, very down to earth guy, but enough down to earth that he was careful about his privacy. And everybody talks about that, particularly later on in his life, that you couldn't just drop in on Andrew Wyeth.
Yeah, I was going to say, and how did you even get a hold of him?
I don't remember. I think I had a friend who had a friend kind of thing, It was a connection. And this was where actually being involved with the Mennonites being a fairly plain people in that area. I'm a fancier Mennonite, if you will.
You are actually.
I'm sitting here in my cowboy snap shirt, but there's a genuineness about them. So they didn't have any trouble getting in touch with Andrew.
Yeah, interesting.
The people, yeah.
And so you leave that department and that museum, and then you go.
I eventually came back I went to Greeley, Colorado for a couple of years, director of museums there. Then I was at the Molly Brown House for 2 years, the unsinkable Molly Brown.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that. Yeah, who is she?
Well, Molly Brown was this wife of a man in Leadville who was a mine manager, and Mr. Brown essentially responsible for as a mine manager breaking through and finding a whole new deposit of gold, a huge vein of gold, and overnight because of that in Colorado, Leadville, Colorado,
in Leadville,
and almost overnight they became millionaires. They became quite wealthy. So they bought this house in downtown Denver, and his wife Margaret Brown. She didn't really like being called Molly.
And is it still there? That building?
The house is still there. It's a museum, and she's most known by people because she was on the Titanic.
Right.
And then you have the unsinkable Molly Brown and all of that. And so that.
And she didn't die.
She did not die. She's one of the people that survived the Titanic.
That's why she's the unsinkable.
That's right. She is the unsinkable Molly Brown. Interestingly enough, though, the result of that experience was she came out very strongly advocating for greater safety and more lifeboats and all of that. And because of the Titanic episode, now we have adequate lifeboats, safety procedures, and things like that on all these cruises that are leaving from Miami and who knows where else. That's because of Margaret Brown and some of the other people who were survivors of the Titanic saying this can never happen again.
And gold in Leadville.
In Leadville, yeah. Well, and Denver.
I mean, without the gold, she's not on the Titanic.
That's right. The gold in Leadville, and of course that afforded her enough money to travel around the country.
There's a good puzzle one
doing
right
for
there.
the causes, doing for the causes.
Yeah, and so that house in Denver is open. You can go see it at the museum.
It's an open museum.
Do you know where it is in Denver by any chance?
It's right near the Capitol, right downtown.
Yeah,
I don't. It's on Pennsylvania Avenue.
And you were there for quite a few years.
Just 2 years.
Yeah.
But what happened was I enjoyed that. But when this job with the Buffalo Bill Museum came open, it was like, yeah, I want to do that. Engraved. That's right. Thank you. I want to do that work. I really was excited about that. And I got the job. And one of the first things I discovered was everybody was confusing us with that museum in Cody, Wyoming.
Right.
Because that's that portion of that museum is the Buffalo Bill Museum. We're the Buffalo Bill Museum. So we have the body. They don't in Cody, Wyoming. He's buried at the museum.
Denver,
and that's why
in
Denver on top of Lookout Mountain overlooking the plains there. And because that's why there's a museum there in the first place. So, well, let's put the name in. So from that point on, I said, we have to start calling it Buffalo Bill Museum and Grave to distinguish ourselves from the folks in Wyoming. And of course, to remind them, we've got the body, they don't.
Yeah. And who was first? Who had the first museum?
Actually, the first museum was the one in Golden, the one on Lookout Mountain.
In Denver.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Golden. And how long has it been around?
1921.
Oh my, a very long time.
Very long time.
So just 4 years after his death, they had started it.
That's right. That's right. And then they started the one in Cody in about 1927, I think, thereabouts.
Yeah, which he founded that town.
He had founded the town of Cody. They were all quite surprised when he said he wanted to be buried in Denver. But he said...
His sister was there?
He died at his sister's house. He liked the view. And if you've ever been there, or I would encourage anybody to go there, it's an incredible view. On the east, you look across the Great Plains. Denver's laid out at your feet. To the west, you look and you see the snow-capped Rockies. It's a beautiful spot.
And there's a huge number of people that go and see that every year, right?
Yeah, about 500,000 a year.
Yeah, go to see his grave.
Yeah. And it's never that crowded, so don't let the 500,000 put you off.
And why do you think Buffalo Bill Cody is so remembered? I mean, even today.
Well, I often say he was the right person, the right place, the right time. He was the kind of guy, he was very smart. He was an opportunist. He took advantage of opportunities when they were offered. He figured things out. He also goes into show business at a time when the whole American publicity machine, mass media is just really taking off. So he becomes one of those mass media darlings early on. But the other thing is, he wasn't just a product of the media. He lived the world as it was in the Wild West.
Yeah, he was the real deal.
He was the real deal. He got the Congressional Medal of Honor because of an engagement he had with Lakota warriors as part of being a scout. He scouted for the Army. He was well admired by members of the Army, by Generals Sheridan and Sherman. So he was, at the point he was starting to be publicized, he was actually already in the news. And
he was like Pony Express, right? When he was like 14
he was in the
like
Pony Express when he was young. He was just right there. He was in the Civil War, Pony Express. He was in some of the early wagon trains that went across carrying goods. He was essentially a teamster for a while. He did it all. And he knew the folks.
Yeah, he knew Kit Carson, right?
He knew the folks. Yeah, he knew them.
worked with him.
And he'd worked with the vaqueros. So when he created his show, he had vaqueros, he had cowboys. It recruited his former enemies, the Lakota, and not only used them in the show, but became really one of their best friends, advocating for their rights. And then my third book is about Lakota performers. He helped them perform and preserve their culture when American policy was basically to destroy it. And, so that's why I liked working at Buffalo Bill Museum.
Because he's a complex individual.
A complex individual, definitely complex, but in my mind, a guy mostly with his head in the right place.
So let's just start a little with the history for Buffalo Bill for those people who didn't know about him, because this really, I think, you're probably considered one of the experts in this field, I would think. 22 years at the museum, the Buffalo Bill Museum and Grave.
Sheer osmosis alone,
You've got 2 major books out. You've got another one that you're working on. And so he starts out in, he's about 1846 he's born, something like that?
Born in 1846 in Iowa. And then the family moves. They moved to Kansas or to the Missouri River, 1854, just as Kansas Territory is being opened up. His family is among the first to move into the Kansas Territory.
And that's wild country. That's just the West.
That is the West. Yeah. That is the beginning. Essentially, that's where the prairies, but the Great Plains begins pretty much in Kansas. And so if you were living along the Missouri River and you meant a couple of hours to the west, you're in the heart of it. You're in the heart of the Great Plains.
Yeah, and Indian country.
And Indian country. Interestingly enough, the Indians that were around when he was growing up, the Kickapoo Indians and some of the others where he was growing up, were very friendly and they got along well. He had really even friends among the Kickapoo Indians, which is really important when you consider what happens later, because he has to deal with hostile Indians, if you will. I mean, they're on the Indians' lands there, and you don't have to argue the point whether they were right or who was right. Fact of the matter is they were interlopers on the Indians' lands. So he has to deal with them, but he has this bedrock of understanding and experience with friendly and Indians who are friendly. So he has a different attitude. He isn't one of those guys that went out and said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Mm-hmm. He was like, the Indians are just trying to protect their homes. He even said that after the Custer battle. He said, that was a battle. It wasn't a massacre. The Indians were being pursued by trained killers, the army. Mm-hmm. They were just defending their families and their homes. And he said that in 1890, only 14 years after the Custer battle. Yeah. So he was kind of saying the right things by our estimation early on.
And so he leaves home pretty early. I guess he was doing the Pony Express. He must, he's young, just a little teenager.
That's right. Well, he was actually even before that, when he first started riding in the wagon trains, he was 11 years old. Mm. And his father had died. His father had spoken out against having slavery in Kansas and was stabbed and nearly died from being stabbed by a pro-slavery man. And while he recovered from that, he never entirely recovered, and he died of a fever a few years later. So at age 11, Bill Cody is basically the man of the family, and he has to earn money.
So he has that same thing in common with Wild Bill Hickok, whose family was very against slavery, because they worked together too at some point.
That's right. He and Bill met on one of the wagon train journeys across the Great Plains and became friends. Yeah, and they even have an encounter or two during the Civil War where they're each working on one for the Union Army, and at one point, Wild Bill Hickok is actually acting as a spy, and Cody runs across him. There's these stories,
and true stories.
True stories, yeah.
And so he's working at 11 on wagon trains. Mm-hmm. By 14 or so, he's doing the Pony Express.
Pony Express, yes.
And then what happens after that?
Well, after that, we're starting to approach that Civil War time. This is Bleeding Kansas time. Mm. This is when there's raiding going back and forth across the Missouri. So you have the Jayhawkers attacking the pro-slavers in Missouri and vice versa. This is when Lawrence, my hometown, is burned by Quantrill. This is all going on then. And so he actually gets involved with the Jayhawkers for a while. So Buffalo Bill, and he's got issues by that with his father going through what he did. And their family was really kind of oppressed, if you will, by the pro-slavery people when he was growing up. Mm. So he actually works as Jayhawker for a while.
Abolitionist,
yeah. it's interesting. His mother dies. He was very close to his mother. She dies, and he says he went on a 2-month bender, encouraged by Tanglefoot, which was a term for cheap whiskey. And he gets really drunk when he says he awakes to discover he is enlisted in the Union Army. And so he becomes a part of the Civil War at that point. After the Civil War, he is mustered out, and he, because of his knowledge of the plains, begins working as a scout. And he's hired by Kansas Pacific Railroad to hunt buffalo. And that's where he gets the nickname Buffalo Bill.
And he kills like 4,600.
Yeah, something like that is, in his whole life, he may have killed 11,000, which seems like a lot to us, but there were millions.
Yeah.
And he
Tens
did
of
his,
millions, actually.
yeah, exactly. And when he did his hunting, they were still there. He was not part of the hide hunters that came later and decimated and almost took them extinction. I always point this out. His was an early voice saying, we can't do this to buffalo. We have to save them.
And he was hunting for meat. He was hunting for the military.
He was military and for the railroad. He had to feed the railroad workers.
And this would have been after the war. This is really when he gets that. So after 1868, he's doing this somewhere in that 1868.
Right. That's exactly the time that he's 1868, 69.
Yeah.
And there was a poem at the time, Buffalo Bill, always aims and shoots to kill. And the company pays his Buffalo Bill. So anyway.
So he quickly got that moniker. He liked it.
Yes, he didn't mind it, no.
Yeah, and at that point, had he started to take on a persona of dress and things, or was he still, just a,
The persona of dress is really, the dress that he's wearing is very typical for the Scouts. They dress more flamboyantly in buckskins.
Why is that? To be just identified?
Yeah, I think they identified themselves as sort of a special group. They were not regular Army or anything like that. They were on contract. And so they sort of live their own lives in some ways.
Yeah, he was only like a private, wasn't he? Though he got the Medal of Honor, I thought.
Well, actually, he wasn't even a private. As a scout, he was just under contract.
Yeah.
He wasn't enlisted or anything. And they took away his Medal of Honor just after his death, because they decided since he was not enlisted, he was not eligible for a Medal of Honor. Then in the 1980s, they decided to open this case as well as some others. And they said, it doesn't matter whether he was actually signed on the dotted line as an enlisted man. He was under contract with the Army. He undertook the same things they did. He went through the same dangers. He performed the same act of heroism. Why shouldn't he get it? So they reinstated his Medal of Honor in about 1988, 89, something like that.
And so when he's working for the U.S. government, that's during the Indian Wars, basically?
Yeah. And it's on and off work. It's kind of interesting. During that time, he's trying to come up with different things. And this kind of relates a little bit to my next book, which is Eating and Drinking with Buffalo Bill. He actually gets in trouble in Fort Hays because on the side, he's been bringing in alcohol and selling it to the military. They go off base, and he had this a little shop where he was selling them sherry and brandy and wine and whiskey, and he got closed down by the government. They confiscated all of his goods.
He was selling it to the military?
Because he was selling it to the military guys, and he did not have a license or permission to do that. So it's kind of an interesting little record among some of the others I've run across while I've been working on this book about eating and drinking with Buffalo Bill.
And so when does the whole Buffalo Bill phenomenon, because he doesn't just go Buffalo Bill show, there's some iterations
it builds
that
up
are
to
earlier.
That, yeah.
So what's the first iteration that he goes, okay, I've done these real things. I've been a scout. I've done, buffalo hunter. I've been in the war, but that world's changing, I assume. And at some point he goes, there's got to be a different route for me to still make a living.
Right. Well, there's a point where he meets Ned Buntline. And Ned Buntline is a dime novel writer. And Ned Buntline writes a dime novel. It's a serialized across 11 issues in the New York Weekly. It's very popular. It's called Buffalo Bill, King of the Bordermen. And this sort of propels him he's been in some articles, news items, but this puts him in sort of this new level as a popular figure.
I see.
This is sort of the beginning of the mythical, legendary figure of Buffalo Bill.
And when would that have been approximately?
Let's see. That's 1870.
Yeah. Okay.
So 1870, 71. But what happens then is he decides in early 1872 to take a trip back east at the urging of Ned Buntline and some of his friends in the Army. And he goes back east and he's becoming sort of feted and going to all these parties in places like Chicago, Buffalo, Rochester. He ends up in New York. And at the same time as he's there, there's a play based on Ned Buntline's dime novel called Buffalo Bill. It's playing in the Bowery. So the two of them go to the play, Buntline and Buffalo Bill, and he sees this guy playing him
in 1872.
In 1872, and he's like, near the intermission, he stands up and he gets that standing ovation, and the crowd just loves him, and he's starting to think, wait, this is a possibility. Ned Buntline says, hey, you should be doing this for a living, and finally, between his thinking this is a good idea and Ned Buntline pushing him, by that Christmas, he decides to appear with Ned Buntline and another guy, another scout he knew named Texas Jack Omohundro.
Yeah, who was
and
a
the
real
three,
guy. Real cowboy.
Real cowboy. Yeah, the three of them appear on stage in Chicago, and he takes off with this stage play. He does these plays at opera houses and theaters and things like that all over the U.S. for 10 years. But near the end of that 10 years, about 1882, so this is 72 to 82, 82, he's starting to think, this could be bigger. This could be bigger. And in 1883, he creates Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the big outdoor show with not just a few people on stage, but all of the animals, Indians riding, fake battles, stagecoaches, wheeling around the center of the arena. And that's what really takes off. And the next 30 years, that's where he becomes almost a household name.
So 7 years after Custer's last stand, but still 3 years before Geronimo's capture, he starts the Buffalo Bill show.
Right. And this is about that being the right person at the right place at the right time. He's just does it just when the nation is eager to do it. The West is starting to disappear. He says, you want to see this, West. You want to see what's going on there before it's gone entirely. At one point, their advertising even said, because at this time, people are starting to discover more and more dinosaurs, and they're fascinated with that. He says, you would never miss seeing a dinosaur if it was live in person before you. So why would you miss seeing this Old West that I can show you that's disappearing so rapidly?
And that's 1883.
Well, that starts in 83. That happens a little later on, but it's 1883 that just takes off. And it goes to Europe too. And it influences the minds of people in Europe. So today, we still have people coming from Europe to this country because of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and they want to experience the Old West. In fact, at our meetings this weekend, we have people there from Scotland. We have a woman I spent quite a bit of time there from Germany who started this fascination when they were growing up because of Buffalo Bill.
So where does he open up first? Where does he start this show? Does he start it in the East Coast?
He starts it in Omaha, Nebraska.
In Omaha.
So he's practicing a town called Columbus, and they get it all together. They go to Omaha. It's very successful. And then they go to St. Louis, and they make their first trip around the United States.
And did he go and get, different individuals like Sitting Bull, and at that point?
Sitting Bull starts in about their, 1885, their third season. Okay. So he starts early. And Sitting Bull starts, of course, because he also had Annie Oakley start that year, too.
In 1885.
1885.
So he's looking for the top build people with the biggest name recognition.
The biggest name recognition, as well as the Indians, as you know, with the biggest name recognition, like Sitting Bull. There were some other people who were part of his show who at that day were very important in terms of being leaders among the Lakota. He had Pawnee, Lakota, a few other tribes also participate, but over time, he pretty much narrowed down to using the Lakota warriors. The Lakota warriors had sort of a fire in the belly that he liked in terms of their showmanship, and they had the rock stars. The Lakota had Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, the big names people were seeing at that time.
Did Crazy Horse do it? I didn't know that.
No, he didn't. I'm sorry, I should say. Those were Lakota, though.
Yeah.
And so he got who he could. They knew who they were. I mean, who knew Roman Nose, and some of these other people who were lesser known among other tribes.
And how did they get paid? What was their...
They were paid well. Basically, the Indians were paid on a scale very similar to that of the cowboys and everybody else. That's one of the things Buffalo Bill was very careful to do. He wanted to make sure that people, all the people, were treated fairly and paid fairly in his show. he was very loyal to his people, and they were very loyal to him.
And so by what time does this really explode? Does it explode right off the crack? And you see so many photographs of Buffalo Bill and posters and all sorts of things. I mean, he was clearly out there.
The first season was a little rocky, 1883 into 84. By 1886, he's appearing at Madison Square Garden. It's starting to take off.
Really going
Yeah. And then 1887, he goes to England. And what happens is he is received so enthusiastically in England and then elsewhere in Europe that feeds back into all the newspapers in America. So when he finally returns to America to perform, there's been all this great publicity and everybody wants to go see. And of course, he milks it. He and his publicists milk it for everything. Come see what the Queen of England demanded to see.
And did she?
She did. It was a sort of a special show. She asked him to come to Windsor and perform there on the grounds of Windsor, only for her and her court.
Oh my gosh!
So
and
it was a special demand. Really.
Yeah, how many people would have been involved in a play like that in this show?
It depended. That varied. By that time, 1887, there were probably maybe 400 to 500. But the largest number of people that were part of it, and when I say 400, that includes the support personnel too. So your performers, you might have had close to 200 people performing, but there were all the support personnel.
And these are basically cowboys, Indians doing battle, and Annie Oakley doing her tricks, gun tricks, and things like that.
And he wanted to show the diversity of people. So he had the vaqueros out there. He had the cowboys. And one of the things, and later on as the show grew, they added other people. They added Russian Cossacks, gauchos from Argentina. And by 1910, they even had a Australian bushman demonstrating, or Aborigine demonstrating how to throw a boomerang. I mean, they just brought whatever in what they could. They even had Hawaiian soldiers from Queen Liliuokalani's entourage that came and performed one season with him. So what they wanted to show people was the diversity of lifestyles and things like that when they came. And without television or YouTube or anything like that, today we see this so regularly. In those days, this was highly unusual.
And he was the ringmaster.
He was the man. Well, he would come in and introduce it. And he was always central. I mean, he was really the biggest celebrity of the show. Even Annie Oakley did not approximate his popularity.
And what would he do in that show? What was his job?
Well, he certainly announced some. He had a regular announcer, but he would often say, "Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to introduce to you Buffalo Bill's Wild West." And, you do that kind of thing. But he would ride around and demonstrate shooting buffalo and use blanks and shoot the buffalo. And that was, oh, wow, look, it's Buffalo Bill hunting buffalo right in front of our eyes.
And they had real buffalo at one time.
Oh,
right?
yeah. He had a herd of buffalo he took with him, a small herd of buffalo.
Yeah.
and it was amazing. When he had buffalo, elk, regular deer, sometimes bears, and all of these animals went along. It was kind of not all that different from a circus.
I was going to say, it sounds like a circus of the West.
And sometimes they called it that, but it was really a Wild West show. Yeah. It wasn't a circus.
Circuses were big at that time, too.
They were
really huge.
And in fact, he was competition for the circuses. Sure. And at one point, he combined forces with Bailey, Barnum and Bailey. Bailey came in and became a partner and worked with Buffalo Bill's Wild West for a while, too, before he actually died then. So that was it. This was one of the biggest shows. I mean, you had the big shows on earth, the circuses, but you had Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which is big. At its largest, it had 650 employees working with it. So not only do you have all the performers, you've got the guys that have to cook the food. And that's another thing I'm going to be working on in my book, is talking what it took to do meals for people 2-3 times a day on the road. And he had special equipment that he and his people put together to make that work. So it was a huge show, and it moved to town. It was a huge economic boon for the local community, too. People would come in from all the towns, outlying towns. They'd stay in the hotels. They'd buy food. And it was a very, very good thing to have Buffalo Bill's Wild West visit.
Yeah, so he was a real rock star. He was maybe one of the best known personalities in the world at that
Oh,
time.
definitely, definitely. In fact, and he was better known without television or radio or anything like that. I like to say he was bigger than Elvis, maybe not physically, but bigger than Elvis in terms of his popularity. And he did all of that without any other media than the print media, and lots of posters and things like that, and word of mouth. You know, it was.
So he was a great marketeer, clearly.
Yeah, and he hired. The other thing is he couldn't have done all that himself, but he knew, as any good leader knows, you hire the right people and get them to do the work for you. And what a lot of people are doing, in fact, some of the people who are here at the convention, other writers are starting to examine who were these other people that work with Buffalo Bill. So there's a wonderful book out about John Burke, who was his publicist, and what John Burke did and how that fit in with that. Ned Buntline, there's a new book about Ned Buntline going to be out in a couple of years.
Oh, that is interesting.
So
then Buffalo Bill also in 1893 does the big World's Fair in Chicago, and that's a big, major, important thing for him monetarily. Well, maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
They wanted to be part of the Midway, and they told him they'd no.
Yeah.
So they bought land right outside of. We have a great picture in the collection at the museum there that shows this setup right outside the show, and you see the Ferris wheel in the background.
Right.
But
the first Ferris wheel.
The first Ferris. The
Made
first
by Ferris.
That's right.
That's right.
But when you got off the train, you could go left. You go into the World Columbian Exposition. You go right. You go into Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Yeah. So he
set it right up to the to the entrance.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he had almost as many people visiting his show as went to the World Columbian Exposition. So they were having something on the order of 15,000 people per show, 2 shows a day. And standing room only sometimes too.
And he was open 7 days a week, unlike
That's
the fair, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was huge. He left Chicago a millionaire.
Yeah, he said something like 2 million people went through his show or something like that.
Yeah, it was incredible. And there's sort of those points where he goes to a new plateau. He was at a new plateau when he came back from England, and that reputation. The next huge new plateau was actually only a year later. He came back from England and Europe in 1892. 1893, he's at the Chicago World's Fair. And that just puts him on the top.
Makes all this money, which was huge, huge money. And, of course, 1893 is one of the biggest depressions in the world at that time. But he has all this money. So what does he do with it? Because I know at some point he starts a town.
Well, that's it. He hasn't really gotten involved with creating the town of Cody yet, but he is living in North Platte, very generous to people in North Platte. He's given money away, hand over fist, things like that. He does then at that time, that's about the time they get started creating the town of Cody, Wyoming. He sinks a lot of money into Cody, Wyoming as well.
And why Cody? Why that place?
He had been in the Bighorn area, and he thought it was very fertile. It is a very fertile area if you can get enough water into it. Mm-hmm. And he just saw this as a place that he felt would be a good place to develop. Also, you have Yellowstone National Park being created, and he had this idea of having these hotels. So you have a hotel in Cody, Wyoming, and then you have another hotel half the way or most of the way to Yellowstone National Park, and then another one right at the entrance, and then
He's
you're in
thinking
the
like
park.
Fred Harvey, basically.
Yeah, essentially.
Did he
that's
know
what
Fred
he's like.
Harvey? They would have been a
I have not found anything on that
time frame for sure.
But see, I have to have another conversation like I had with you yesterday, where I learned something new about this, and maybe I can learn something about Fred Harvey.
Yeah, that would be very interesting, because I would think that would be a model that he would have used, and it's kind of the similar time frame. When is Cody founded? Do you remember approximately?
I don't remember that one.
But like the 1890s?
Yeah, 1890s or thereabouts.
Yeah, so that's when Fred Harvey's making his hotel in Waukesha and these different places, Albuquerque, Alvarado Hotel, making a lot of money.
Making a lot of money. Buffalo Bill is not making as much as Fred Harvey is. Of course, Fred Harvey has got the connection with the railroads is much stronger between him and them. But you have him putting a fair amount of money into Cody, Wyoming. Not long after that, early 1900s into 1911, he starts putting money in Oracle, right here outside of Tucson, and putting mines in. He always had this gold bug like so many people do. In fact, in 1859, as a young man, that's one of the things he did. He was part of the Colorado gold rush to Pikes Peak, and he didn't find any money then, or didn't find any gold then. And again, he's trying to find it in Tucson area, north of
Oracle. And
Oracle.
how does he end up in Oracle? Do you have any idea how that even happened?
There were some people he knew who were really into this area. They'd come down, some contacts. I mean, he had contacts everywhere. Right. And he would come into Tucson and eat and drink. And there's a club here in Tucson, and I've got to look into a little more, that he was kind of a private gentleman's club that he would come to occasionally.
When was this? Do you know what time frame?
This would be around 1910, 1913.
Oh, that's interesting.
And but the thing of it is, everybody says he lost his shirt down here on these mines. And in fact, there were some guys that were kind of swindling him. That never happens in connection with mining, does it?
No, never.
never. And so there are some folks think he lost his shirt. Some people thought he made a lot of money, but he didn't let anybody know, and he spent it, and it's all gone.
Yeah.
I'm of the opinion he didn't lose as much as some people think. I'll be frank. I think he lost more money in Cody, Wyoming than he ever lost here in the Tucson area. So, but they don't want to talk about that.
In Cody, they don't?
Well, yeah, because Cody was still a fledgling town, and he died before Cody could really become the neat community that it is now.
And he never got any of the hotels or any of that kind of stuff, right?
He had his hotels, but he had some other stuff. But sometimes he would go enough in debt that he had to sell those off. He was very generous. He also made his share of mistakes investing. And so he
mines in Oracle. What else were the big screw-ups?
Well, he put some money in some oil wells, I think, up in Wyoming that did not do well.
Yeah, I think I read that. Okay.
Yeah, and there's just some other things. He tried to start a boys sort of military / scout training school in Cody, and that didn't work out. He tried to start a company that would provide an alternative to coffee. And that didn't go well. It was kind of, I forget the name of it. He had these little schemes. And then there were people come to him, and they'd say, I've got an idea for money for this. And he'd just pull off a wad of bills and help him out. And, his kids and family took a lot of his money. One sister in particular just was always trying to get him to invest in her husband's schemes and things. And so he lost some money through that.
And do you think
sister.
part of that is that he takes this show that never existed and is hugely successful? He's a persona throughout the world, and he just doesn't see the fact that he could fail.
Yeah, he didn't. There was a point where he almost failed in New Orleans, and he almost gave up the show, but he kept with it. But he left New Orleans $60,000 in debt, which is a big chunk of change.
And what happened in New Orleans and when?
Well, he went to New Orleans in 1884.
So that's right after he gets going on.
Yeah, that's right. This is kind of his second season, and he thinks, well, most of the time it was a summer show, and that's the way he did it for the rest of the time after that. But he thought, well, maybe I can do it in the winter too. So he thought, well, New Orleans is south. It's going to be warm there.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Well, it did make sense, except for the moment he arrived, there was a streetcar strike, and they didn't get that resolved for over a month. And people couldn't get out to see the show. And then the weather turned bad, and they had torrential rains. And basically, between the bad weather and the streetcar issues, he lost a lot of money. He just could not get it to work.
He lost $60,000?
Something like $60,000.
Wow, that's huge in 1884.
So he was like, I'm ready to throw in the towel. But his business partner, Nate Salisbury, convinced him to stick with it. And of course, that next year, there were some really good things that came out of the New Orleans experience, though. He met Annie Oakley there. There were some other things that were very positive, but didn't pay off. And the next year, he hires Annie Oakley after they leave New Orleans. The next year after they get out of New Orleans, he hires Sitting Bull. And those things really make a big difference.
And how long did they stay with the Wild Buffalo Bills show?
Well, Sitting Bull was only for 4 months.
Yeah.
And he got tired of doing it. He just wanted to go home.
Yeah.
Annie stayed from 1885 to 1901. And then there was a really bad train accident. And that's when her hair turned white when she was going in for treatment for it. Nobody really knew what happened with that. And she just decided that she, after having that almost near-death experience on the train, she wasn't going to be riding trains as much anymore.
Got it.
And they were on the road all the time with the Wild
And how long does the shows go on? Till when? When do they close down?
Well,
I mean, he dies in 1917, but
What happens is he makes the mistake of borrowing some money from a guy in Denver by the name of Harry Tamman. Harry Tamman is one of the co-owners of the Denver Post. A bit of a scalawag and I shouldn't say swindler, but he found his way of getting money out of people. And he got Buffalo Bill into a bit of a problem with a loan he made him. And took advantage of some of Buffalo Bill's naivety and foreclosed on a loan in the middle of the season. Previously, Buffalo Bill had never had troubles. By the end of the season, he always made money because there was that ebb and flow of money.
Sure.
If you had a few rainy days, well, you'd make it up later with better weather. Well, he made the mistake of signing a contract with Harry Tamman that said he'd pay $20,000 back within the first 2 months of the show. And he had not made enough money to pay that back. So Tamman had the show seized in 1913 in Denver. That was the other mistake, that they were actually appearing in Denver, and he had the show seized, and the show was sold off at auction in August of 1913.
wow.
So Tamman then forced Buffalo Bill to appear with his show, the Sells Floto Circus, which I think was his objective all along.
It was his intent.
That was the
Give him the
intent.
money, let him fail. I'll close it down, sell off the
Exactly.
assets, and I'll open my own, and I'll still have him to work for mine.
Sounds kind of familiar when you think about what happens today, isn't it?
Yeah, and did he?
And he did that, and he worked for him for 2 years. Buffalo Bill finally paid to have his name back so he could actually use his name and go on and work with another show out of Oklahoma. And he did 1 year with that, and that was the year before he died.
And what did he die of? Do you know?
He died of kidney failure. Now, what caused the kidney failure is a point of some debate. Some people say it was from the alcohol, but he hadn't been drinking much since about 1905. And even then, he went on the occasional benders, but he did not drink as much as he had as a young man.
So he was a drinker early.
Yeah, he was a drinker. That tanglefoot that got him to enlist in the Union Army continued to bug him. But he was not an alcoholic in the sense that he could go for months on end without any
he was
drinks
a
at all.
binge drinker.
Yeah. So he ends up dying of this kidney failure. Now, recently there's a doctor in Boulder who's done some analysis, and he thinks that he died of white powders. So what happened was he had a lot of headaches 2 years before he died, and he kept writing for these white powders that were for sale in Canada but were prohibited in the United States because they caused kidney failure. So he was taking these kidney failure inducing white powders for headaches, and this doctor's theory is that was what got him.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it's probably a predecessor of the ibuprofen, because if you have too much ibuprofen, it'll destroy your kidneys.
All those will, actually.
Yeah. So
Unless you want to do Tylenol, that does your liver.
that's right. It just choose your organ.
It's a much more dangerous thing, quite frankly.
Oh, the
Tylenol.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Acetaminophen
Oh
is
yeah.
very
Oh
dangerous.
yeah.
Now,
Definitely.
I want to talk a little bit about this because this is one of your books. I haven't read it, but my God, it's fantastic. Lakota Performers in Europe. So this is from the 1890s time frame that he does
actually,
this? Or tell us about this book.
Of course, he hires the Lakota Performers already in 1883 when he starts the show.
Right.
But by 1887, they're mostly Lakota Performers working with the show, and that's when he is invited to go be part of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee celebration. He takes the show there. It's a rousing success, and the people are absolutely fascinated, not just to see the reenactments in the arena. They are interested in seeing how the Indians live. This is a very important thing to the Europeans. They want to know the Indians' lifestyle because they're so very different. And so they're traveling around Europe with Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and it becomes very popular, very unusual. And so Lakotas back in Pine Ridge find that if they go and travel with these shows, they can not only get good money because they were paid well, they can see the world, but they can continue to do the dances and retain the culture that American policy at that point is aimed at destroying.
Yeah, because it's outlawed.
It is. They're taking the young kids to Indian schools, shaving their heads, beating them if they speak their language.
Carlisle.
Yeah, Carlisle,
There it is
exactly.
right there, by the way.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
There's an image of the Carlisle school.
And of course, the philosophy at that school was kill the Indian, save the man.
That's right.
And everything that Buffalo Bill was doing was antithetical to them, and they were constantly criticizing him and the Indians who chose to perform. Interestingly enough, despite all the promises to these kids when they went, oh yeah, you're going to be able to work just fine in the white man's world, they would graduate and they couldn't get a job. Nobody would hire them.
Yeah,
they'd end up back on they'd end up back on the reservation without any work, but they could speak English as well as Lakota.
Yeah.
So they were the perfect performers to recruit to be part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. So the schools inadvertently actually fueled this rising livelihood of some of the Lakota, which would be show business. Some of them started with Buffalo Bill in 1883, continued doing the show business all the way to 1935. This book cuts off at 1935 because World War II intervenes and everything changes for the Indians, for Europe, and all of that. But it's a rather interesting period and rather pivotal period between 1887 and 1935, because that's when the Indians are able to fight and preserve their culture by being in these shows. And at the same time, they're influencing Europeans' understandings about America and a great deal of sympathy on the part of Europeans for the Indians, which continues to today.
Would they do the ghost dance there?
They didn't. Actually, there's an interesting engraving that I ran across that said some of the ghost dance leaders actually, after the ghost dance was put down, were taken out of jail by Buffalo Bill. He got permission to take them to Europe. And it says they're doing the ghost dance, but they're not wearing ghost shirts. There's a couple of other things, although some ghost shirts ended up in Europe. So I think there may have been some ghost dancing going on too.
But they would do these ceremonies as the performers.
As performers.
And what did they do? You say it goes to 1935, but he's done, long before that. Is there other shows that kind of...
There are.
Sidekicks at, the Buffalo Bill... secondary.
Yeah. Well, there are people who are inspired by him. See, so the moment Buffalo Bill's Wild West goes popular in the United States, there are other shows that are copying it. In fact, some former employees go out and start their own shows. So they're touring in the United States. When he goes to Europe, they also start touring Europe. Then there are people in Europe. The Circus Saraceni, which was started by a German guy in Dresden, he decides he just loves this. He starts dressing like a cowboy and starts doing a Western act as part of his show. And he starts sending people to the Lakota reservation, to Pine Ridge, and recruiting Lakota to work for them. So there are other shows that start recruiting the Lakota to go to Europe as well. So, at one point, you might have had 150 Lakota traveling at different points across Europe showing their culture, which has a real impact.
And it was pretty much Lakota.
It was pretty much Lakota. There were a few other performers from some other tribes.
Has anyone gone back and talked to the descendants of these people? Because I assume they all end up back in America by 1935.
Yeah, in fact, one of the descendants is the guy that wrote sort of the foreword for the book.
Yes.
And we have a photograph of him and my collaborator on the book. Well, he's become a friend of ours. And he is the son of a couple that went to Europe with their other children. He was the youngest son in 1935. And so those are about the only folks that are left, and he's getting rather old.
I didn't know if maybe just that, the history went down from generation to generation, my grandfather, my great-grandfather.
There is some of that, and I use a few of those in there. George Dullknife, who's a descendant of a Dullknife who was part of Buffalo Bill's
What's their
Wild West.
take? What's their take on all this?
They're among the Lakota, those who had family that performed, there's a good deal of pride in this.
There is.
There really is. The folks who tend to claim that Buffalo Bill abused them or took advantage, or that tend to be more deprecating of the Indians that did go over there, they tend to not understand. They don't know their history. They don't know the stories. Many of the stories they're believing are stories that actually white men have come up with and telling back to them. So it is interesting. I mean, it's not entirely without controversy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real dichotomy, I would think, with Buffalo Bill, because he was an Indian fighter.
He was.
I mean, that's...
But after
really
the Indian Wars, and there tend to people who look at just that, and you don't realize that after the Indian Wars were over, he became an advocate for their rights. He spoke out for their rights. When they were touring with the show in Washington, he would set up meetings with not only the people that were the Indian affairs, but he would set up meetings with presidents. So he would make it so that some of the leaders among his group would be meeting with people like Teddy Roosevelt or McKinley, folks that were pretty high up, so they could plead their case. Interestingly enough, over time, those people, some of them, became advocates for Indian rights and policy as well, and went to Washington on their own from the reservation, let's say in the 1930s and into the 40s, advocating for Indians' rights. And those were folks that got their grounding in Wild West shows, who also went to Europe and saw what was there, saw what they had to deal with. They understood the people they were dealing with, the white men, the authorities, and all of that, because of their exposure.
You know, it's interesting that a guy like Buffalo Bill is so well known. He can get a hold of a Teddy Roosevelt or McKinley.
He had a lot of influence. He actually
that's amazing.
Supported both of them in their presidential campaigns and spoke out on their behalf. And he also very much admired Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot for their efforts to create parks and forest land and protect them. Buffalo Bill himself, by 1890, he visited the Grand Canyon and in hopes that they could scout it out and maybe urge the country to create some sort of a natural preserve there. This is long before the Grand Canyon became a national park.
He just wasn't looking for mines?
He wasn't looking for mines then. One of the things, and this is what's kind of interesting and people don't always understand today, was this whole development of these parks was also intended as a way of preserving game, so that they would have places where they could continue to hunt game, because as wildlands disappeared, so did the wild game.
And they'd seen what happened to the buffalo.
That's right. So preserve the game, preserve the lands, and then if you're a hunter, that's what you do. And today, for example, in Colorado, there are so many more elk in Colorado than when I first started doing my hiking there in the early 70s.
I think, throughout the West.
It is, and it's because of wildlife management. It's because of the hunters, to be quite frank.
Yeah, well, they pay for a lot of it.
They pay for it.
Fees.
Yeah, they pay for the fees and stuff like that, and that makes a difference. And I think people like Roosevelt and Buffalo Bill understood that would be something that would save the game, give them an opportunity to continue hunting, and still preserve some of the wildness in the West.
What do you think's the most interesting or unique story or fact about Buffalo Bill that maybe most of us wouldn't know?
I'm sounding like I'm shamelessly promoting a book that hasn't been written. I'm still writing it, the eating and drinking with Buffalo Bill thing. But what got me started thinking about this was a friend of mine wrote a book called Taco USA about the history of Mexican food in America. And he said, did you know that Buffalo Bill opened the first Mexican food restaurant east of the Mississippi in New York City in 1886? Now, has anybody ever thought about Buffalo Bill opening a Mexican food? So he opened a Mexican food restaurant or cafe as part of his Wild West show when it was at Madison Square Garden in 1886. They served enchiladas, tamales, mezcal. That was pretty popular. The hot chocolate.
Wow, now that is a very good factoid.
It is. So that's what most people don't think about. That got me thinking about what other things did Buffalo Bill do that were offbeat. And I love food. I'm the main cook in the house, and I've always been fascinated with gourmet cooking. So I decided to look into this more. Buffalo Bill introduced the popcorn ball to Europe. So they're selling these little round balls of popcorn rolled in sugar to the people at their concession stands in 1887, 1889, 1890.
So there's two food things. And he also knew Frederick Remington, right?
Oh, yeah.
And Frederick Remington did some paintings of him. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. That's pretty interesting.
And Buffalo Bill's connection to art is another other thing that's not so well known. Yeah, he knew Remington. He knew Albert Bierstadt. His portrait was painted by Rosa Bonheur, one of the most famous artists of her day in Europe, in France, when they were there with the show.
Did she come to him, do you know, and said, I want to paint you?
Well, she came to him and asked permission to paint pictures of the buffalo, because she'd specialized in animals, of the Indians, and then finally, as thanks, she decided to paint a portrait of Buffalo Bill as well. And that portrait today is probably her best-known work. It's up at Cody, Wyoming, at the museum there. When he was also in France, another important thing happened. Paul Gauguin visited the show. He loved it. He visited the show a second time. He was so excited about it, he went out and bought a Stetson hat. And I have seen a self-portrait that he did in Tahiti later on. It's in the Orsay Museum in Paris, where he's wearing that Stetson hat. I am convinced that's a Stetson.
Now that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And so what with Remington?
Yeah, let's go back to Remington.
So tell us a little bit more about Harper's Weekly and some of the things that he might have done with.
Yeah, and I think Buffalo Bill first met Remington in connection with some of the work that Remington was doing for Harper's Weekly. He would do drawings of the Wild West performers. He was in England in 1887. The year that he did drawings of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And some of the performers, and then did a short article, and that was in Harper's Weekly. He did several of those over the years. In fact, I just acquired one that was in a Harper's Weekly from 1894 that he did in London that Remington had done, and I've got just the page for that Harper's Weekly in connection with my research. So he did those, but then he went the next step eventually, and he painted Buffalo Bill in the arena. And there's a great painting of him in the arena that Buffalo Bill then sort of took a portion of that and put it on one of his programs and used it as one of his Wild West programs. It says, painting by the famous artist Frederick Remington.
Do you know when
Buffalo
that
Bill.
painting was done?
I'm not sure when the painting was done. I think,
or where it's located.
I know where it's located. It's located again at Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody.
And Cody has it. Yeah.
So they have that one. They have Rosa Bonheur's painting too.
And then what was Bierstadt's connection?
Oh, there's one other painting by Frederick Remington when he was hosted by Buffalo Bill at his TE Ranch outside of Cody. He did a painting, just sort of a quick painting of a ranch hand there, which he presented to Buffalo Bill. And that's in the collection at the museum I was at, Buffalo Bill Museum.
And so that was sometime before 1909, because that's when Remington dies.
Right. That would have been 1899 or thereabouts.
And his connection with Bierstadt, what was that?
Bierstadt, well, he met Bierstadt in 1889 when he was in Paris. So he met Bierstadt and Rosa Bonheur, and I think the two of them, also Bonheur and Bierstadt, met each other. That was probably their first meeting. Then I have a record of him later on in New York doing a dinner with Bierstadt. Bierstadt never did any paintings of Buffalo Bill, though, like Remington, but they did know each other. He knew Thomas Edison. I mean, he knew all the movers and shakers. Oh, somebody else that saw the show when it was in Paris in 1889 is the painter of The Scream.
Oh, yeah. Edward Munch.
Edward Munch. He was there doing a kind of a painting internship with this guy, and he went to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West. So you have these interesting intersections going on.
And how do you know? I mean, how do you know that information? In other words?
Well, that's where I have David McCullough to thank. He ran across that when he was doing he did a book on Americans in Paris, basically.
Yes.
And he mentions that particular intersection, I believe.
Oh, that's really interesting.
But there were other paintings that Buffalo Bill kind of considered himself a patron of the arts. So he actually commissioned some paintings from some lesser known artists see, this is why I wrote a couple of these down so I could remember.
No notes allowed.
You don't allow me. Too late. Irving Bacon, A.D.M. Cooper. See, these guys aren't quite as well known.
Yeah, though A.D. Cooper at his time was really a well-paid artist. He was getting $10,000 for his paintings, even though they don't even bring that now today, really.
Yeah, and Cooper did a sort of a trompe-l'oeil still life of a buffalo head, and then it has some pictures of Buffalo Bill around it and some other artifacts.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's what he did of him. And then another personal favorite of mine, Charles Stobie, C.S. Stobie, not too well known. He was an artist and painter and photographer in Denver. And he went on a hunting expedition with Buffalo Bill and the Bighorns and did a couple of paintings of that. And then Buffalo Bill bought them from him and put him in the Irma Hotel, which was his downtown Cody hotel, and had another one out in his parlor at his ranch. The Irma Hotel one ended up at the folks at Cody, Wyoming, at the museum there. And the other one that was in the TE Ranch ended up at the Buffalo Bill Museum. And for 20 of those 22 years, it was on the wall directly opposite my desk. So I could sit there and gaze on that every day. It's a very neat little painting, too.
So we've gone through our hour, believe it or not.
Okay.
But tell me any final takeaways you'd like anybody to know about, like how they can find your books. That would be a nice way.
Well, the books are a little harder to find. The Buffalo Bill book is still quite available. I'm hoping the Lakota performers in Europe will be reprinted in paper bound. It's available on Kindle, but the hard volumes are completely sold out. That printing is over. But Amazon does have Kindle of that. And those are my two best ones. And then my Modest Mennonite Home might be out there.
And your website? You have a website?
I do not have a personal website. We're working on it now. That's because my wife and I also do museum consulting. You know, when you retire, you're not the last thing I'm going to do is sit in front of a TV all day.
Yeah, no,
there are
clearly
too many things you can do. So,
I'm looking forward to the next book, which sounds like it'll be very interesting on Buffalo Bill. We won't give it all away, but very interesting, and I hope to see lots of artists' information in that one.
Well, I'll try to include as much as possible.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
I appreciate your having me here today.
All right. We'll get you back to the conference because I know you got to go.
Okay,
all right,
thanks.
The Art Dealer Diaries are brought to you by Medicine Man Gallery, located for over 26 years in Tucson, Arizona, specializing in antique Native American art, early Western art, including the famed Maynard Dixon, as well as modern art. You can find everything online at medicinemangallery.com. There's over 6,000 objects to select from. Also, the Charles Bloom Murder Mystery Series, written by yours truly, me, Mark Sublette. There's 6 books in this series, and they follow the protagonist Charles Bloom through all the intrigue of the art world set in Santa Fe and the Navajo Nation. These can be found on Audible, eBooks, Amazon, and of course, the gallery at medicinemangallery.com.